I'd like to start by introducing our panel. We're very, very privileged to have the panelists that we have. Next to me, I have Joe Weinman. Joe Weinman is the Senior Vice President of Telx. Some of you may have already heard Joe speak this morning. Joe's responsible for cloud business and strategy at Telx. He was also named one of the top 10 cloud leaders in the world. And he's the author of a very, very important book called Cloudonomics. If you haven't read it, buy one. That's the plug, Joe. Next to Joe, I've got William Fellows. William Fellows is the Vice President for Research for 451 Group. William's role is to identify emerging technologies, and one of those emerging technologies, of course, is cloud, and he's responsible for Cloudscape service offers at 451 Group. Next to William, I have Richard Hall. Richard Hall is the founder of CloudOrigin, which he founded in 2009. He's the chief exec. He focuses on the business impact of cloud, and he spends his time as an independent advisor to multi-billion-dollar deals in major blue chip brands, in private equity, venture capital, and other situations. And at the very end, last but not least, we have our very own Alex Bligh, who's one of the co-founders, CTO and COO of Flexiant. Alex has been a serial entrepreneur and was also a founder of Nominet, which many of you will be familiar with Zara Networks and with Redbus Interhouse. So I'm going to try and move the slides. Wish me luck. So of all the things that Flexiant could have spoken about as a keynote, why did we choose this topic? Well, let me just spend a couple of minutes before we go into the debate and explain the imperatives that are driving business in cloud are well known and well recognized. Analysts are now beginning to quantify the impact of cloud and on public cloud services. This is a mashup of various people's predictions that George Knox presented at the start of today. What's interesting is that everybody's being very, very positive about the growth in the use of public cloud services. There was one analyst that we kept off of this mashup, which was Gartner. Gartner are predicting a 42% compound annual growth rate in this space. So there is no doubt that value is migrating from somewhere. We believe it's migrating from the enterprise market to the public cloud services. In a recent white paper, good, I'm always checking now because I'm nervous. In a recent white paper which Flexiant produced and Alex wrote, this paper was downloaded more than any other white paper that Flexiant had produced, and the engagement level that we had was very, very large. Clearly there's an appetite for this topic. And broadly, that's the reasons why we chose this as the keynote debate today. So a good starting point is to ask Alex to summarize his views on the economic advantages of using a public service provider as an alternative to on-site private cloud.
Okay. I think this argument is really about the meeting of two forces, economic forces and cultural forces. I think the last presentation, if you sat through that, was the cultural force, which is generally the force of resistance. But the force that's pushing people towards public clouds is really economics. Private clouds, at their least cloudy, if you like, can be a collection of servers in a cupboard, whereas a public cloud is provided on huge scale, and those huge economies of scale that are there are reflected back down into the prices that the end customer is going to charge, and also into pushing down the costs of providing that service. So the main factor that's pushing people inevitably towards public clouds is an economic one, and those economic arguments are driven by scale where resources are shared. That, in my view, is the key driver.
Joe, can I invite you, because you spend a lot of time in Cloudonomics talking about the benefits and the economic benefits of various aspects of cloud. Can I ask you to respond to Alex's opening comments? Joe?
Question me. Sorry, you can't hear a word in here.
Yeah,
so
the sound is bad.
I can hear what people are saying out there. Briefly, obviously this is a cloud event. I love the cloud. The cloud is wonderful. The cloud is magnificent. But that said, I think that there are a lot of complicated nuances around which kinds of workloads from which kinds of companies are going to move to the cloud for which reasons. And so rather than blindly assume that everything will move to the cloud, I think it's better to say, let's understand which workloads have which characteristics and also which organizations have which characteristics. So to start the ultimate debate going, what I would say is that the argument that all computing will move to the cloud is not that dissimilar from saying that no one will live in a house, everyone will live in a hotel, no one will own a car, everyone will only drive taxi cabs, or similar arguments, right? Ultimately, it becomes a question of, on the one hand, owned dedicated resources, and on the other hand, pay-per-use on-demand resources. Now, all that said, there are clearly some businesses that by definition can only exist in the cloud or that only make economic sense. And for a simple offline example, I would consider this convention. This, for all intents and purposes, is a cloud function regardless of topic, because rather than us holding this event at any of our own houses or holding it individually untethered separately in each of our own houses, we needed to come together to a central location with the scale to handle this type of event. And moreover, collaboration, like we're engaged in right now, and communications requires the ability to interact. So I've looked at a number of business models that are inherently cloud-centric: communications, collaboration, contests, things like checkpoints and filters, for example, for anti-DDoS attacks. Those all belong in the cloud regardless of what the economics are. You're not looking at saving a nickel per server. But that said, I think that there's still an argument to be made for legacy systems where the migration costs don't necessarily achieve any kind of meaningful payback to migrate those to the cloud. For private cloud architectures where even a limited amount of statistical multiplexing can achieve benefits, and I think with the diffusion of technology for a medium to large provider, they can achieve scale and unit cost points that say that total cost for a workload that can run in either location could potentially be just as well done in-house as long as there's a relatively flat demand profile. So I could go on, and in fact I do for 416 pages, so I think I better just quit there with that brief summary.
So, do you want to jump in?
So I'm from a research company, so we talk to end users on an ongoing basis about what they want to do moving forwards, what the drivers and inhibitors are. And I mean, it seems to us, I agree with Alex, that public cloud provides this illusion of infinite capacity, because by whatever your definition of private cloud, it assumes some kind of finite set of resources. So if you want to have access to some of those things that give you this illusion, then you're going to have to use some kind of third-party public hosted cloud. But I think the way users are coming at this is that rather than one or the other, they want to make rational decisions about where to put different kinds of workloads based upon the characteristics, as Joe talked about. And what we're seeing is the rise of this concept called best execution venue. So end users increasingly have all kinds of ways of understanding the costs associated with workloads, putting them in catalogs, TCOs, SLAs against them. So what is the next logical step then? Well, the next logical step is to be able to send those jobs and workloads for processing, for execution in the most suitable environment. That may be a private on-premise system, it may be some public hosted cloud, or it may be some dedicated environment. But it's still a pretty gnarly place at the moment. For the most part, folks have bilateral relationships, and that's really where the market is at the moment.
So I think it's interesting talking about a market, because we've been talking about many ways, demand-side issues here. And of course, many of us are coming from CIO, IT director backgrounds, looking at how we might divide up our existing application estate. But if for a moment we flip to supply side, I spent a lot of time working with some of the largest software houses on the planet and brand new startups, particularly SaaS, software as a service providers. I haven't met a single ISV who isn't planning to become a software as a service provider. And the brutal economics on the supply side are your valuation is between 3 to 5 times if you're a SaaS provider than if you're in the old world selling on-premise legacy solutions. The belief that we will have a choice in a few years to still buy an on-premise solution, I think, as when we talk about ultimate trends in the next sort of 3 to 5 years, will be vanishingly small. We will just not have the option to take a latest version or a latest service or anything resembling our current product set from those vendors because the vendors will not be offering them. I think that's one of the biggest reasons we have to sort of face up to the changes in the industry. This morning we saw very sad news around 2E2. We can look back a few months and see what's happening at HP EDS. Value is being torn out of the existing supply chain and the traditional vendors, large and small, being decimated as a result. Equally, there's huge new opportunity coming for vendors who can step in and deliver in this model. So I think one of the things we have to remember when we're talking about a balance between public or private, certainly in the next few years, hybrid models will be there and many people will be transitioning. Absolutely nothing wrong with using private cloud techniques to saturate and wring out the last bit of sweated investment out of sunk costs you already have in tin and existing on-premise apps. But your plans for the next few years have to be very different.
So I'm not sure I agree with that, which is the purpose behind the debate. So I think what is really interesting is if you have to look at the economic factors, and also this is a stretch, but assume that there are rational economic decision makers, which normally rational decision making is tough for any of us that are humans because of behavioral economic factors, cognitive biases, and so forth. But that said, if you say that it's ultimately a battle between a set of opposing forces. On the one hand, on the private side, there are things like the endowment effect, where people like to own things, as well as the sunk cost and extracting value out of those sunk costs. But in addition to that, if you look at the end state, you have to say, is there an inherent advantage that hyperscale cloud providers have strictly on a unit cost basis, excluding the business models that I talked about that by definition must go into the cloud? And there you're playing a game where, yes, there probably are some economies of scale. Yes, there's some technical innovation, but by the same token, those technologies are diffusing. So as an example, take Facebook Open Compute. They've designed the best server. And if it's not the best now, then, since it's open source hardware, basically it'll just get better and, won't be able to be beat. Now, that's good for cloud providers, but also those companies that are thinking about buying servers can use those designs if they want and build their own servers, or have someone like a Flextronics or High Precision Industries build it for them. Or as server vendors leverage those designs, they will do open compute type designs. Same thing for cloud operating systems / orchestration software. So ultimately what it comes down to is a unit cost battle, and the negative issue that service providers have is the fact that they need to add in their SG&A expenses. They need to show up at events like this and sponsor booths and hand out marketing swag. So all that said, again, there's no question that service providers will have a role, but if you say that you can mathematically show, which I have, that the economic optimum is in a hybrid architecture, what that says, there are several implications to that. First of all, it says that the real value in the ecosystem comes about from being able to dynamically migrate workloads to where they can best be run and seamlessly provide either a pane of glass for orchestration and to provide a little bit more intelligence in the network through things like SDN very broadly, including there's a lot of creative things going on now, like Adva Optical is working on optically aware extensions to OpenFlow. All the things that basically say that a hybrid architecture that includes private resources and cloud resources, and by the way, to take that to the next level, open markets and exchanges and brokerages for those cloud resources, and also things like open standards like the IEEE is working on to enable that type of inter-cloud interoperability, that ultimately is where the value goes. And moreover, I guess from a SaaS or PaaS provider, what I would say is that I particularly respect those providers that are offering their wares not restricted to a particular delivery model. And one of the examples that I use is Starbucks, right? Starbucks used to have to go to a coffee shop to buy their coffee. Then they started selling it, and about 10% of their business, even though they're a service provider, comes from selling grounds, in other words, private Java, if you will, in your own coffee maker. So companies like ActiveState that provide private PaaS, either you can run it in your own data center or you can run it in the cloud, I think provide the greatest flexibility to provide users with options and let them leverage the best of both worlds. Now, just to wrap up, I don't want to come across like I don't like the cloud because I'm being deliberately ordinary to help create a little debate here, but just to counteract some of that, what I would say is that there are lots of amazing cases where the economics of the cloud are provably best in a pure public utility model. And one good example of that is time compression, where if I have a workload that takes 1,000 server hours, I can run it on one server for 1,000 hours or 1,000 servers for 1 hour. If I did that myself, there's a 1,000-fold increase in CapEx to do that. If I do it via a public provider, it's exactly cost neutral, right? So there's lots of great use cases for why you'd want to use the public cloud. I just don't think it's necessarily even an end state for all computing.
I think one of the factors that we've all missed so far is time. So you've talked about an economic optimum point, Joe. Well, I'd sort of bring back your original analogy. You said not all of us live in a hotel. Some of us like to live in houses. Well, let's imagine that we were talking 30 years ago in the early 80s. We'd have said, mobile phones, they're really quite heavy and quite expensive, and they don't really suit every environment. And yeah, there may be a long transition phase, and actually my application, which is my receptionist who sits at the desk, that's a legacy application that's very difficult to transition to this new, expensive, peculiar mobile phone technology. When we look at it now and say, how many of your phone calls do you make using a mobile phone? For many of us, that's over 70 or 80%. It's the dominant way of providing service. And it's taken maybe 25, 30 years for that change to make. So, I fully expect that optimum to shift. You've made good points about legacy applications and things that are not easily provided on public clouds at the moment. There's a whole host of other retardants like security, jurisdictional problems, etc. But in general, they're one-off costs for the industry or its consumers to get over, whereas the irresistible economic force of saying we can run this thing more cheaply if we do it that way, we can drive down the cost of providing phone calls by not having to put copper wires in, and also it's far more convenient, far more flexible. In the end, that's the irresistible force. So the question for me is not ultimately in 50 years' time or 100 years' time, are cloud technologies and that sort of avenue to get scale going to be predominant? Because I think it's pretty obvious they are. The question is, what's the transition time to that, and what applications are the easiest, where are the low-hanging fruit, what's going to migrate on next? And that applies through PaaS, through IaaS, the whole range.
Avoiding having to provision for peak capacity is always going to be a big ticket for CIOs to take to their board when they're fighting for budget, right? But swapping CapEx for OpEx doesn't necessarily affect the bottom line. So cloud is not necessarily going to be cheaper for all users. And I think Joe's used the analogy before about it's much like, owning a car when you're prepared to pay a bit more to own the thing for a period of time rather than own it over its lifetime. And certainly the end users in our research program, so their top cloud projects for 2013, over 50% of them told us it was around private cloud. And one of the reasons is because they have better clarity and better vision into what the cost savings can be on their internal estate than they can out on the cloud at the moment. And which is why I think we're seeing such a rash of startup and innovation coming from companies who are working on addressing that whole question. I don't say it's not going to happen, but certainly those kinds of things need to become more transparent. So when we ask end users about what kinds of providers and services they want to work with, it turns out that things like security, trusted relationships and availability are the things which are important to them much more so than the brand, the name or the technology. And things like price and SLA are somewhere in the middle.
So if I put my private equity hat on and look at what we do when we're acquiring, carving out companies, and these are often companies at global scale, operating at $1 billion turnover, 30 countries, etc. One of the first things we do is probably rip out all the existing IT, completely replace that. In one case, we did that in under 3 months with pure cloud-based services. What people are looking for in these transactions absolutely isn't just an economic equilibrium price point. I think that would be misconstruing. They're also looking at things like risk transfer. They want the vendor to be responsible for patching the operating system. They want the very latest updates applied to the software that day, not on a release migration schedule 6 months later. These are very significant factors. They may be opening up new global offices and closing them at the rate of 1 or 2 a week, and they want flexibility. These are all business reasons, but they're not just down to pure, simple arithmetic netting up over a few years of the cost of an on-premise versus a utility. But all sorts of other economic and rational drivers pushing people towards cloud adoption. And again, I come back to, if we look at application workloads, CIOs tend to look at their existing estate and the workloads they've already got and think about optimizing that. CFOs, CEOs tend to look at what applications do we need, how many of those are now coming externally, if all the integration and customization, which may still be there, is now running on the provider's servers, no longer on our own, again, we take away a lot of the reason for having our own private architecture in the first place. So I don't doubt that some of it will still exist. I just think it's going to be a vanishingly small percentage.
I think one interesting thing about the point you make is that we tend to aggregate all of the characteristics of SaaS providers and assume that it's a monolithic model that can't be in any way broken up or adjusted. And what I mean by that is a SaaS provider encapsulates lots of different things. First of all, there's a competency, right, which is whatever the software does. And I like to think about a tax preparation SaaS provider obviously has a competency in how do you fill out your taxes and where do you take the deductions the best, et cetera. Secondly is a delivery model, which is it's offered, typically over the internet, right, through some location-independent spot that you don't necessarily need to know about as a user. Thirdly, there's a management and or maintenance model that includes, the ability to incorporate upgrades. And fourth is a rapid development philosophy that says that I tend to apply patches very frequently. Now, all those things are good. There's no question that they're better than the old ways of it takes 10 years and $1 trillion to get software that doesn't work. But now the question is, looking forward a few years, to Alex's point around you can't just look at what's so now, but what is happening or can happen, you can really slice out those different characteristics. And so you already have SaaS providers, and you've had for over 5 years, that are willing to do private deployments on premises, right? The cost of doing an upgrade is certainly, yes.
Can I ask you to summarize? I want to try and
so
get a
in summary, that's it.
So my job as a moderator is very easy. I ask one question and everybody moves on. I want you to try and create an opportunity for 1 or 2 questions from the floor. Is there a microphone? Microphone's there. Who has the first question for our panelists? No questions. Please, yep. And we've literally got about 4 minutes left, and then we see red dots at her forehead.
Picking up on the best execution and the marketplace themes, where does the ISDA for the cloud come from? The standard derivatives contracts, standard descriptions of the products rather, so that you can actually sensibly trade and shift around between them. where does that commoditization come from?
I'm not sure I heard the whole question, but I think that there are a lot of technologies and systems and sort of third-party providers that are doing things around that. So for example, Service Mesh is a company that helps characterize workloads and migrate them. You've got things like, just to pick an example, HP Cloud System that lets you take your image and push a button and run it at any service provider, you know, open virtualization formats, Cloud Switch. So I think there's a lot of companies that are working or already have solutions around helping with the dynamic migration. And then lastly is the standards effort, where, as I mentioned, IEEE is working on a number of intercloud standards, part of which is to provide commonality for things like identity and authorization, authentication, but also some of it is around that workload migration capability, including things like resource description frameworks.
So we're tracking a couple of dozen vendors, I suppose, who are providing cloud broker services of some description, either as a kind of a basic meet me introduction service or as a higher order of federation, integration, and so on. And the jury's out on which way they're going to go. This year, I think we'll see IaaS as an exchange-traded product, which should start a number of alternative markets for a commodity offering with a certain set of parameters. I mean, big organisations have been doing this internally for some years now, so there isn't any reason why someone can't try this out in the real world.
Okay, I want to squeeze one more question in if I can, please, if that's all right. Anyone along here, perhaps? And we have to be brief. We've got about a minute and a half left officially.
Hi, a nice simple question. Paddy Falls never fail. What is the enterprise killer app for the public cloud that'll get enterprises to really start adopting public cloud?
Test Dev. Test Dev is the gateway drug to the cloud.
Richard, any other thoughts?
I think and CRM.
Well, yes, I mean, clearly, from a SaaS perspective, the biggest adoption, we have some wonderful companies in Europe and the US who are all competing very well globally around HR, and often HR BPO, so that whole outsourcing of everything about payment, flexible benefits, pensions, etc., all taken through, and all the software and infrastructure to support that. Next on, I say absolutely Salesforce and CRM examples in many different guises, and then pure accounting solutions. Those are the ones we're seeing broadest deployment of globally, companies of all sizes.
And I'd even add email to that list very briefly. I mean, look at Gmail.
So tomorrow I'll be talking on this subject at this time on moving from the playground to production on precisely these themes. So come along and listen.
Okay, we've now run out of time, so I'd like to thank the panelists. I knew this was going to be too short a time for a topic such as this. Definitely the debate will continue. I'd like to thank the panelists for making my life very, very easy. Please, if you would like a copy of the white paper, drop by our stand at 337. There's some other speeches and presentations that we're giving over the next 2 days. Please come and engage with Flexiant and get to know us. And if you could just help me thank the panelists, that would be very grateful and very appreciated.